paid him a lot of money. Good evening. It's October 23rd, 2020. Hope everybody is having a good day or had a good day and is having a good evening. Earlier I did a video in which I took us back to October 23rd of 4004 BC, the alleged time of creation of the world. We're not going to go quite that far back this time. We are going to go back 35 years. October 23rd, 1985. And anyone who knows me well knows my fondness for dates and anniversaries. And I remember that was one day that really stands out in my mind. On October 23rd, 1985, I was living in Kaufman, Texas, where I was serving as pastor of Macedonia African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I was also employed as a social worker at Terrell State Hospital, a psychiatric facility about 12 miles from Kaufman. And I was 34 at the time, and ever since I'd gotten my master's degree in 1976, I had been talking about going back and earning a PhD. And as I approached the age of 35, rightly or wrongly, I looked at it, well, it's now or never. And that particular day, the AME Church had a state planning meeting on the campus of Paul Quinn College, then located in Waco. It moved to Dallas 5 years later. But Bishop Rembert E. Stokes was over Texas at the time, and he had sent my resume to Dr. Warren W. Morgan, the president of Paul Quinn College, and we discussed the possibility of me obtaining employment there. And I talked with Dr. Morgan at this particular meeting, and I told him about my plans to pursue PhD studies at Baylor University. In fact, I was fixing to leave there and go to the Baylor campus and check it out. And that's what I did. I arrived at the Tibble Bible Building, the headquarters of the religion department, and I went and talked with the religion chair, Dr. Glenn Hilburn. Dr. Hilburn was an awesome man. He taught at Baylor for many, many years, and he influenced many, many lives in a very positive way. It would be in the fall of 1986 I would have him for a very good course entitled History of Roman Catholicism. He was with me every step of the way from the time on October 23rd, 1985, he was very positive about me applying to the PhD program. He indicated there wouldn't be a problem. He didn't think there'd be a problem me getting accepted, and thought I'd do very well, and I did. But I just had one class with him, but we saw each other from time to time, and even after I graduated, I maintained some contact with the school. It would be, I'll say more about this later, but it would be on November 20th of 2015, 30 years later, I would see him for the last time. He was, at the time, a patient at the Hewitt Care Center outside of Waco. And I went by and had prayer with him. And a nice visit. The following June, Dr. Hilburn passed away at the age of 86. And I'll always be thankful to God to have been able to have that last visit and prayer with one of my mentors. But Dr. Hilburn encouraged me to apply. I got the application materials to apply for admission to Baylor's PhD studies in religion, and which would be I would start there in the fall of 1986 and complete my dissertation and graduate in May of 1995. That was a major chapter in my life. But after my time I would also be going to work at Paul Quinn during the fall of 1986, and we'll say more about that later. I eventually would have my first teaching experience there. And the ride's been a good one. We had ups and downs down through the years, but I thank God for the blessings that have come along the way. That evening I spent at a place called Espinosa's Ice House in Waco. There was a fajita house in the same building, and I ended up eating some good Mexican food that night and talk with Steve Espinosa, the owner of the facility, and his wife Alma, who at the time was a secretary in the School of Social Work at Paul Quinn College. And a number of the customers who came by, I met for the first time Ernesto Fraga, the editor and publisher of a Hispanic newspaper called Tiempo. And I would end up writing many articles for Tiempo down through the years. I spent time there doing research because back in the 1970s, when I was a student at Baylor working on my master's in church and state, my roommate was Mike Contreras Jr. And we roomed together in 1973 and 74. We had some contact after that, but after 1976, we didn't have any more contact for a number of years. And in the 1980s, I got his phone number. I think it was in 85, I got him on the phone. And I was telling him some of the things I had been doing over the years as far as my pastoral ministry and my social work experiences and my writing. And Mike observed, you've done the things that you said you were going to do when we were rooming together. Well, I called him and he met me that night at Espinosa's Ice House, first time we'd seen each other in nearly 10 years, and it was a great reunion. We maintained our contact for the next 30 years. Mike passed away on August the 12th, I believe it was, of 2016, and he and I remained good friends for a total of 43 years, and I thank God for that. Recently, his sister Maria told me that Mike loved you dearly and spoke of you often, and I'm thankful for that. But Mike and I, one time when we were rooming together, went to a place of entertainment one Sunday night called the Abraxas Club. And I had just, at that time, not too long before that, had become a Scottish Rite Mason. And I had begun reading the book Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike, which deals with a lot of different esoteric subjects. And Pike was into comparative religion very heavily, as I am. And he mentions about a Gnostic concept. I knew the Gnostics were denounced as heretics by the early church, Abraxas being the plenitude of divine emanations, and 365 emanations from the Godhead, the plenitude of divine emanations represented by the mystical word Abraxas. And it really, I found it very interesting that a nightclub in Waco would have the name of a Gnostic religious concept. And I had done some contacts to find out where did they get the name. They got it from the Santana album. In 1970, the Mexican rock star Carlos Santana released an album called Abraxas, and the most famous song from the album is Black Magic Woman. Carlos Santana is one of the best guitarists of all time. His music is outstanding, and they were big fans of Santana. And so they named the club after his second album. And a lot of the people there had been going to Austin and been a part of the music scene there. And they said, hey, why can't we have something like that in Waco? So they managed to get a club going. Waco's not near as big as Austin. Anybody who knows anything about Austin knows 6th Street is the music capital down there. And Waco doesn't have anything to compete like that, but Waco does have a substantial music scene. Music history has been very big. And many, sadly they're passing away now, but many of the musicians, past and present, were spent some of their formative years at the Abraxas Club. They had live bands. They paid their musicians well. Waco was pretty segregated at one time, but many of the clubs that operated were for white people only. The year I was born, 1951, there was an ad in the Yellow Pages, the Waco phone book, for Walker's Auditorium, for colored dancing. That was the exact words. That club operated from end of World War II to the mid-70s. Primarily African American. There was some predominantly Hispanic, but they generally didn't get together much until that time. But Abraxas was different. The late Tony Calhoun, a black musician, said the Abraxas Club was the first time he ever partied with Mexicans. He passed away in the last few years, as did a prominent Mexican rock star, Joe Silva, and a musician of Czech descent named David Zacek. They were all outstanding and all performed at the Abraxas Club. They got the name from Santana, but where did he get it from? And I began searching, what I call a long search for connecting links. And I finally produced a lengthy document, which you might almost say is a book. There's a picture of Abraxas, the Gnostic concept with the head of a rooster, human torso, serpent legs, pulled by a chariot with white horses, a shield in one hand and a whip in the other. All that had symbolic meaning for the Gnostics, Basilides of Alexandria. And as I began to study psychology and mental health issues in the early 1980s, I was especially drawn to the writings of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, J-U-N-G. And very interesting book, The Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead by Bishop Stephen Heller from Ecclesia Gnostica. I've corresponded with Bishop Heller in California. I've also talked with him on the phone. And there's his picture of Carl Jung. It was in the early 1900s, after his break with Sigmund Freud, that Carl Jung went through a period in which he calls his confrontation with the unconscious. And it was various experiences he had, and he wrote down this work called Seven Sermons to the Dead, in Latin, Septem Sermones ad Mortuos, and in which he deals with many Gnostic ideas, including the idea of Abraxas as the plenitude of divine emanations, in which good and evil are united and transcended. And one of Carl Jung's famous patients was Hermann Hesse, the German novelist, and one of his famous novels was Demian. Now, Hermann Hesse was like a guru, a cult hero. He had a great deal of influence on the counterculture of the 1960s. And he was, many kids of that era read Demian, Siddhartha, Steppenwolf, and many other Hermann Hesse novels. But he had received psychotherapy from Joseph B. Lang, a disciple of Carl Jung, and eventually from Carl Jung himself. And in the novel, his main character is Emil Sinclair, who has dealings with a man named Max Demian. He's sitting in class one day. He's daydreaming. I doubt there's any student who's ever lived that hadn't been guilty of that at a time or another. The lesson, for some reason, may not be interesting, and you can't keep your mind on it. Your mind starts to wander. We all do that at times or another, some more than others. But it caught his attention. And when the professor started talking about Abraxas, it got his attention, because he got a letter from Max Demian who said, "He who the bird breaks his way out of the cage is the world. He who would be born must first destroy a world. The bird flies to God. The God's name is Abraxas." And there's another passage where, in conversations that Sinclair has with a church organist named Pistorius, he says he heard about Abraxas by accident. Pistorius says, no, someone never hears about Abraxas by accident. And as one saint said, I stood before it and began to freeze inside from the exertion. I questioned the painting, made love to it, prayed to it. I called it mother, called it whore and slut, called it my beloved, called it Abraxas. Those very words, with slight change, putting in plural we instead of I, appear on the back of the 1970 record album of Santana. And in my lengthy work that I wrote, I argued that Basilides influenced Jung. Jung influenced Hesse. Hesse influenced Santana. Santana influenced the Waco Abraxas Club. This is unconscious connecting links between 2nd century Egypt and 20th century Waco, in which the Abraxas Club is inseparably linked with the Gnosis of Basilides. I remember that night of October 23rd, 1985, when I was beginning my research and talking with a number of people there. One of the customers of the Espinosa said, "Yeah, I drank a few beers at the Abraxas Club." He was totally unprepared for my response. There's more to Abraxas than drinking beer. There was, at the time, the Texas politics going on, there was a third party that was very active. I teach political science. And I can tell you that not only in Texas, but throughout the country, it's very, very difficult for third party candidates or independent candidates to win elections. But they do get issues on the table that would not be dealt with otherwise. They have served a purpose. From 1970 to 1978, La Razanita Party was quite active. El Partido de la Razanita, the Party of the United People. And they managed to win some elections in South Texas, areas with large Hispanic populations. And the La Raza took over some city councils, some schools boards, and some commissioners' courts. They eventually went statewide. And in 1972, 1974, and 1978 ran candidates for governor. Abraxas was an R&R place for La Razanita activists when they came to Waco. But it was not, again, while it was owned and operated by Mexican Americans, it was open to everybody. Everybody was welcome when they came in. So there are plenty of blacks and whites who came. Interracial couples, no big deal. And they always had good entertainment. In the 2nd century, during the time of Basilides, Alexandria, Egypt was a melting pot. Except for the Chinese, who had not yet arrived, the nations were represented there. Africa, Asia, and Europe came together in this crucible along the banks of the Nile. And history repeated itself with the Abraxas Club, bringing people together across racial and ethnic lines. And many people have good memories. Many people have some negative memories as well. But a number of oral histories have been done. One friend of mine who born in 1990s, too young to remember the Abraxas Club, but he's done a lot of research on Waco history, and he told me he comes up with references to it, multiple references in many of his searches. And I had other interviews there at the club, and not the club, but the Espinosa's Ice House. The club it only operated about 4 years, from like 70 to 74. But in 1991, I attended a reunion at the Waco Missions Club. I was invited by Steve Espinosa, who said, "Bob, you've been writing about us. We'd like to have you come." And I certainly did a newspaper story about that particular gathering, and it was a good time that night. It was October 6th of 1991 at the Waco Missions. And wasn't until 1997 that I published this study of the Abraxas Club for Luxi Tenebris Transactions of the Philaxis Society. And Alcibiades influenced Jung, Jung influenced Hess, Hess influenced Santana, Santana influenced the Waco Abraxas Club. Based on Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious, many things come together that wouldn't be seen as together otherwise. And Abraxas is presented here as an archetypal symbol, to use the language of Carl Jung. And the memories are definitely there. This was definitely interesting research. And again, October 23rd, 1985, I had conversations with Dr. Warren Morgan at Paul Quinn College. A year later, I went to work there. I had had a conversation with Dr. Glenn Hilburn at Baylor University. I eventually, the following fall, the fall of '86, I entered graduate school to work on my PhD, which I completed in 1995. I was at Paul Quinn on and off for nearly 20 years. And these were important institutions at the time and perhaps in the future as well. But I thank God for these experiences. And 35 years ago was a very important day in my life. So, hope everybody has enjoyed this and have a good Friday evening. This is October 23rd. I'm signing off now. Good night.